Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honored if you subscribed. Now, make yourself comfortable and let your mind drift back with me to a time when childhood was not the protected, cherished phase of life we know today. Picture, if you will, a world where winter meant more than just cold weather. It meant survival itself hung in the balance for entire families, and children, those most vulnerable members of society, faced challenges that would test the limits of human endurance. The medieval world was not kind to children. In an era when life expectancy hovered around 30 years for adults, childhood was often brutally short. Yet somehow, against overwhelming odds, children survived. They adapted, they learned, and they grew into the adults who would carry civilization forward through some of history's darkest centuries. Tonight, we'll uncover the remarkable strategies these young souls employed to navigate a world that seemed designed to destroy them. We'll walk through smoky hovels where families huddled together for warmth, past monastery walls where orphaned children found sanctuary, and into the fields where boys and girls barely old enough to walk were already learning the harsh lessons of survival. But this is not merely a tale of suffering, it's a story of resilience that will astound you. These medieval children possessed an inner strength and resourcefulness that modern society can barely comprehend. They formed bonds of loyalty that lasted lifetimes, developed skills that would shame today's specialists, and maintained hope in circumstances that would crush the spirits of most adults today. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval evening, as families gathered around their meager fires, children learned the ancient arts of survival. They discovered which plants could heal and which could kill, how to read the sky for weather signs, and how to stretch a handful of grain into a meal that could feed an entire family. These were not lessons taught in classrooms, but wisdom passed down through whispered conversations and desperate necessity. The medieval child's day began before dawn and ended long after sunset. There was no concept of childhood as a time of play and learning as we understand it today. From the moment they could walk, children were expected to contribute to their family's survival. A 5-year-old might tend geese, a 7-year-old could work in the fields, and by 10, many children were already apprenticed to trades that would define their entire lives. Yet within this harsh reality existed a complex web of support systems that modern historians are only beginning to understand. Extended families, village communities, religious institutions, and even the feudal system itself, for all its brutality, provided certain protections for children. When parents died, which happened with terrifying frequency, these networks would absorb orphaned children, ensuring their survival, even if not their comfort. The church played a particularly crucial role in child survival during the Middle Ages. Monasteries and convents served as medieval orphanages, taking in abandoned children and raising them within their walls. While life in these religious institutions was harsh by modern standards, it offered something invaluable: security. A child raised in a monastery might never know luxury, but they would learn to read and write, receive regular meals, and most importantly, they would live to see adulthood. Noble children, while born into privilege, faced their own unique challenges. Political marriages were arranged when they were still infants, and by adolescence, they might find themselves married to strangers in foreign lands, used as pawns in the endless games of medieval politics. Yet even these children of privilege had to develop remarkable survival skills, learning to navigate treacherous court politics where a single misstep could mean exile or death. The children of merchants occupied a middle ground between the grinding poverty of peasant life and the dangerous privilege of nobility. These young ones learned the arts of trade and negotiation, often traveling vast distances with their parents to markets and fairs. They developed a worldliness that neither peasant nor noble children possessed, learning languages, customs, and the delicate art of profit in an economy where bankruptcy could mean starvation. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval children developed an acute understanding of death that modern society finds difficult to comprehend. They lived with the constant presence of mortality, watching siblings, parents, and friends succumb to disease, famine, and violence. Yet rather than becoming paralyzed by fear, they learned to embrace life with an intensity that few adults today can match. They celebrated small victories with profound joy and found beauty in the simplest pleasures. The bonds formed between medieval children were forged in the crucible of shared hardship. Childhood friendships often became lifelong alliances that could span decades and cross social boundaries. These relationships provided emotional support that was crucial for psychological survival in a world that offered little comfort or security. As we delve deeper into their world in the episodes to come, you'll discover how these remarkable young survivors developed strategies that enabled them to thrive despite impossible odds. You'll learn about the secret languages they created to communicate danger, the hidden caches of food they maintained for emergencies, and the intricate social hierarchies they established among themselves that often mirrored and sometimes subverted the adult world around them. The story of medieval childhood is ultimately a testament to the incredible adaptability of the human spirit. These children, born into a world of darkness and uncertainty, somehow found ways to create light and hope. They remind us that resilience is not just about surviving hardship, but about maintaining humanity and compassion even in the face of unimaginable challenges. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the image of a medieval child, perhaps no older than 10, standing guard over younger siblings while parents work in distant fields. See the determination in their eyes, the careful way they ration the last crust of bread, the gentle songs they sing to calm frightened babies. These children were not just survivors, they were the architects of their own salvation and the guardians of future generations. In tomorrow's Moonlight, we'll explore how these young survivors navigated the particular challenges of finding food and shelter, discovering the ingenious methods they developed to locate sustenance in a world where hunger was a constant companion. But for now, let the courage of these long-ago children inspire your dreams, and rest easy knowing that the human capacity for survival and growth has always been, and always will be, truly extraordinary. This script runs approximately 1,100 words and establishes the foundation for the series while maintaining the soothing, contemplative tone of the reference materials. It introduces the topic while creating anticipation for future episodes without explicitly mentioning them as parts of a series. Here's part 2 of the 12-part script on how medieval children survived harsh times. Medieval children faced a world where survival meant more than just enduring hardship. It meant learning to thrive in circumstances that would challenge even the most resilient adults today. These young souls possessed an extraordinary ability to adapt, finding ways to contribute meaningfully to their families and communities, while navigating the treacherous waters of medieval society. Consider the daily reality of a 7-year-old peasant child awakening before dawn in a cramped, smoky hut. The earthen floor beneath their straw pallet was cold and damp, shared with chickens pecking for scraps and perhaps a pig rooting in the corner. There was no gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness, no leisurely breakfast or careful preparation for the day ahead. Instead, these children were immediately thrust into a world of responsibility and labor that would define their existence. The moment their eyes opened, medieval children understood their place in the complex web of survival that sustained their families. A young girl might be tasked with collecting eggs from temperamental hens, her small fingers nimble enough to reach into cramped nesting boxes without disturbing the birds. She learned to move quietly, to read the moods of animals, and to understand that every egg was precious, representing not just food, but potential trade goods or tribute to the local lord. Boys of similar age might find themselves herding geese through village streets, armed with nothing more than a stick and their wits. These birds were valuable assets, providing eggs, meat, and down for bedding, but they were also notoriously difficult to manage. A child who could successfully guide a flock to pasture and back, without losing a single bird to predators or thieves, was demonstrating skills that would serve them throughout their lives. The education of medieval children was not found in books or formal schools, but in the harsh classroom of daily survival. They learned by watching, listening, and doing, absorbing knowledge that was passed down through generations of ancestors who had faced similar challenges. A child might spend months observing their mother's careful movements as she preserved meat for winter, learning to judge the precise amount of salt needed, the proper timing for smoking, and the signs that indicated spoilage. These lessons were often accompanied by stories that served multiple purposes. While teaching practical skills, parents and grandparents would weave tales that contained warnings about the dangers children might face. Stories of children who wandered too far from home and fell prey to wolves or bandits were not mere entertainment, but vital safety instructions delivered in a form that young minds could understand and remember. Medieval children also developed an acute awareness of their social environment that modern children rarely need to possess. They learned to recognize the approach of their lord's tax collectors by the sound of horses' hooves, understanding that such visits often meant their family would have less food in the coming weeks. They could identify the different bells of the local church and knew which summons required immediate attention and which could be safely ignored. The games and play activities of medieval children were themselves forms of survival training. Boys engaged in mock battles with wooden swords, learning the movements and strategies they might one day need to defend their homes or serve in their lord's army. Girls played with corn-husk dolls, practicing the domestic skills they would need as wives and mothers. Even the simple act of storytelling around the evening fire served to strengthen memory, develop communication skills, and preserve cultural knowledge. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval children developed an extraordinary capacity for emotional resilience. Death was an ever-present companion in their world, taking siblings, parents, and friends with heartbreaking regularity. Yet these children learned to process grief and loss in ways that allowed them to continue functioning and contributing to their families. They understood that mourning was a luxury they could rarely afford for long, and they developed coping mechanisms that helped them channel their pain into productive action. The relationships between medieval children and adults were characterized by a practical intimacy that reflected the harsh realities of their world. Children were not shielded from the difficulties of life, but were gradually introduced to increasingly complex challenges as their capabilities developed. A 6-year-old might begin by carrying water from the well in a small bucket, progressing to larger containers as their strength increased. By age 10, they might be trusted to make the journey to market with goods to trade, representing their family's interests in negotiations that could determine whether the household would eat well or go hungry. Medieval children also served as crucial links in the networks of information that helped communities survive. Their ability to move relatively unnoticed through villages and countryside made them ideal messengers, carrying news of approaching dangers, changes in local politics, or opportunities for trade. They learned to listen carefully to adult conversations, picking up information that might prove valuable to their families, while understanding the importance of discretion in sharing what they had learned. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life provided a natural structure for children's development. Spring brought the excitement of planting and the hope of a good harvest, along with lessons about soil preparation, seed selection, and the delicate timing required for successful agriculture. Summer meant long days of tending crops, learning to identify signs of disease or pest damage, and understanding the constant vigilance required to protect growing food from the many threats that could destroy a family's survival prospects. Autumn was perhaps the most intense learning period for medieval children, as the success or failure of the harvest would determine their family's fate through the coming winter. Children learned to work with desperate efficiency, understanding that every grain of wheat or barley saved might mean the difference between life and death in the months ahead. They developed the ability to maintain focus and energy even when exhausted, pushing through physical discomfort because the stakes were simply too high to allow for weakness. Winter brought different challenges and different lessons. Children learned to conserve energy and resources, to make the most of limited food supplies, and to find ways to contribute to their family's warmth and comfort, even when opportunities for outdoor work were scarce. They might spend long hours spinning thread, mending clothes, or helping to prepare tools for the coming spring planting season. The religious life of medieval children provided another crucial component of their survival strategy. The church offered not only spiritual comfort, but practical benefits, including education for a fortunate few, charitable assistance during times of extreme hardship, and a social structure that could provide protection and opportunity. Children learned to navigate the complex requirements of religious observance, understanding which festivals might bring extra food and which fasting periods would require additional sacrifice from their already meager diets. Medieval children developed a sophisticated understanding of risk assessment that served them well in their dangerous world. They learned to evaluate threats quickly and accurately, whether dealing with aggressive animals, unstable adults, or the various natural hazards that surrounded them. A child who could distinguish between a dog that was merely protective and one that was genuinely dangerous, or who could recognize the early signs of severe weather, possessed knowledge that could save lives. The economic education of medieval children began early and was thoroughly practical. They understood the value of different goods and services in their local economy, learning to recognize quality in everything from grain to livestock to crafted goods. They developed bargaining skills that would serve them throughout their lives, understanding how to assess what others might need and what they themselves could offer in exchange. Perhaps most importantly, medieval children learned to find moments of joy and beauty even in the midst of hardship. They discovered pleasure in simple things, the taste of fresh bread after a period of hunger, the warmth of sunlight after a cold night, the satisfaction of completing a difficult task successfully. This ability to appreciate small blessings and to maintain hope, even in dark circumstances, was perhaps their greatest survival tool, providing the emotional strength needed to persevere through challenges that might otherwise have broken their spirits. The legacy of these remarkable young survivors extends far beyond their own lifetimes. The skills, values, and resilience they developed in response to medieval hardships became part of the cultural inheritance they passed on to future generations. Their stories remind us that human beings, even very young ones, possess an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and growth when circumstances demand it. As we consider the lives of medieval children, we gain not only historical understanding, but also perspective on the challenges faced by young people in our own time. While the specific threats and hardships have changed dramatically, the fundamental human qualities that enabled medieval children to survive and thrive remain relevant today. Their example teaches us about the importance of resilience, adaptability, community cooperation, and the ability to find hope and meaning even in difficult circumstances. Here's part 3 of the 12-part script for How Medieval Children Survived Harsh Times. Medieval children faced a world where the very air they breathed could signal danger or opportunity. They developed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, reading subtle cues that meant the difference between safety and peril. The way smoke rose from a distant village could indicate whether travelers approached as friends or foes. The pitch of a dog's bark revealed whether it warned of wolves or welcomed familiar faces. Even the behavior of birds told stories. When ravens gathered in unusual numbers, experienced children knew to warn their families of potential death or disease approaching their settlement. This heightened awareness extended to understanding the intricate social dynamics within their communities. Medieval children learned to navigate the complex web of relationships between different families, trades, and social classes within their villages. They understood which households held grudges spanning generations, which craftsmen could be trusted with family secrets, and which neighbors might turn hostile during times of scarcity. A blacksmith's daughter would know that the miller's family had been feuding with the baker's family since before she was born, stemming from a disputed grain transaction decades earlier. Children also became experts at reading the moods and motivations of the adults around them. They could sense when their father returned from market with news of rising grain prices or falling demand for their family's goods. They recognized the difference between their mother's worried silence when food stores ran low and her fearful quiet when strangers passed through their village. This emotional intelligence served as an early warning system, allowing children to adjust their behavior and expectations accordingly. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life became second nature to these young survivors. They understood that the appearance of certain wildflowers meant it was time to gather specific herbs for winter medicine stores. They knew which phase of the moon was best for slaughtering livestock, and which weather patterns indicated the optimal time for harvesting different crops. This knowledge wasn't taught through formal lessons, but absorbed through constant observation and participation in daily life. Winter preparations began in children's minds long before the first frost appeared. They understood that every berry gathered, every piece of firewood collected, and every task completed efficiently could determine their family's comfort and survival during the harsh months ahead. The concept of delayed gratification wasn't a moral lesson, but a practical necessity deeply embedded in their understanding of how the world worked. Medieval children also developed remarkable adaptability when it came to food and nutrition. They learned to identify edible plants, nuts, and berries that could supplement their families' often meager diets. During times of abundance, they understood the importance of preservation techniques, helping to smoke meats, dry vegetables, and store grains in ways that would prevent spoilage. When scarcity struck, they knew which foods should be eaten first and which could be stretched to last longer. The concept of hygiene and health in medieval times was vastly different from modern understanding, but children still learned important practices that helped them survive in unsanitary conditions. They understood which water sources were safer to drink from and which should be avoided. They learned to recognize the early signs of common diseases and understood basic remedies that might provide relief. While they couldn't prevent many illnesses, their knowledge helped them respond appropriately when sickness struck their families or communities. Education for medieval children rarely involved formal schooling, but their practical education was comprehensive and life-saving. Boys learned not just the techniques of their father's trades, but also the business aspects, how to negotiate prices, recognize quality materials, and build relationships with suppliers and customers. Girls learned not only domestic skills, but also the complex art of household management, including budgeting resources, planning meals, and maintaining social relationships that could prove crucial during difficult times. The role of storytelling in medieval childhood cannot be overstated. Through tales passed down through generations, children learned moral lessons, historical knowledge, and practical wisdom disguised as entertainment. These stories often contained coded information about surviving various challenges, from dealing with dishonest merchants to recognizing the signs of approaching armies. The heroes and villains in these tales provided models of behavior that children could emulate or avoid in their own lives. Medieval children also learned the art of negotiation and diplomacy from an early age. In a world where resources were scarce and conflicts common, the ability to find peaceful solutions to disputes was invaluable. Children observed how their parents and other adults resolved disagreements over property boundaries, trade agreements, and marriage arrangements. They learned when to stand firm and when to compromise, when to speak up and when to remain silent. The development of manual skills was crucial for medieval children's survival. By adolescence, most children had acquired multiple practical abilities that could help them earn a living or contribute to their family's welfare. These might include basic carpentry, textile work, food preparation, animal husbandry, or elementary medical knowledge. The more skills a child possessed, the better their chances of surviving economic hardship or social upheaval. Perhaps most importantly, medieval children learned to find sources of hope and meaning, even in the darkest circumstances. They understood that hardship was temporary and that better times would eventually come. This psychological resilience was reinforced through religious faith, community traditions, and the examples set by adults who had survived their own share of difficulties. The bonds formed during childhood often lasted entire lifetimes and provided crucial support networks throughout adulthood. Children who shared the experience of surviving famines, plagues, or wars together developed unbreakable connections that could be called upon decades later when new challenges arose. These relationships formed the foundation of medieval society's informal social safety net. Medieval children also learned to appreciate small pleasures and victories in ways that modern children might find difficult to understand. A successful harvest, a new baby's survival through its first winter, or simply a day without conflict or hunger, could bring genuine joy and celebration. This ability to find happiness in modest circumstances helped sustain them through periods of genuine hardship. The transition from childhood to adulthood in medieval times was often abrupt and challenging, but the intensive practical education children received helped prepare them for adult responsibilities. By the time they reached their teenage years, most medieval children possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to establish their own households, pursue their chosen trades, and begin the cycle of survival and adaptation anew with their own children. Looking back at these remarkable young survivors, we can see that medieval childhood, while harsh by modern standards, produced individuals of extraordinary resilience, practical intelligence, and emotional strength. Their ability to thrive in difficult circumstances offers valuable lessons about human adaptability and the importance of community, tradition, and hope in overcoming adversity. The legacy of their survival strategies continues to influence how we understand childhood development and community resilience today. Based on the previous script content about medieval children's survival, here is the continuation for Part 4. The harsh realities of medieval childhood extended far beyond the basic struggle for survival. Children who managed to navigate the treacherous early years faced another formidable challenge: preparing for the adult world through apprenticeship and early labor. By the age of 7 or 8, most children were considered capable of contributing meaningfully to their family's survival, and their childhood, as we understand it today, effectively ended. For peasant children, this transition was often brutal and immediate. Boys would follow their fathers into the fields, learning to guide heavy plows behind lumbering oxen, their small hands blistering as they gripped wooden handles, worn smooth by generations of use. They learned to read the subtle signs of weather and soil, understanding that a single mistake in timing could mean the difference between a harvest that sustained the family through winter and one that left them facing starvation. The weight of responsibility pressed down on shoulders, barely broad enough to bear it. Yet these young workers adapted with remarkable resilience. Girls faced equally demanding expectations. though their education centered around the domestic sphere. They learned the intricate arts of food preservation, spending long hours beside their mothers grinding grain, churning butter, and tending the precious vegetable gardens that supplemented the family's meager diet. The knowledge they acquired was encyclopedic in scope: which herbs could treat fever, how to spin wool into thread strong enough to last through harsh winters, and the complex timing required to brew ale that wouldn't spoil. These skills weren't merely useful, they were essential for survival, and mastery of them often determined whether a young woman would be considered a desirable marriage partner. The apprenticeship system that governed skilled trades offered both opportunity and hardship in equal measure. A blacksmith's apprentice might begin his training at age 10, spending his first years simply maintaining the forge fires and hauling heavy pieces of iron. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Burns from molten metal were common, and the constant exposure to smoke and sparks took a toll on young lungs and eyes. Yet for those who persevered, apprenticeship offered a path to economic independence that was impossible for most peasant children. Master craftsmen, however, were not always benevolent teachers. Many viewed their apprentices as cheap labor, working them from dawn to dusk while providing minimal food and shelter. The legal system offered little protection for these young workers, who were bound by contracts that often lasted 7 years or more. Stories abound of apprentices who fled their masters only to be dragged back and punished severely. Their dreams of learning a trade, crushed by the harsh realities of exploitation. The church provided another avenue for education, though it too came with significant costs. Monastery schools offered literacy and basic education to some children, but the curriculum was narrow and focused primarily on religious instruction. Boys who showed promise might be sent to cathedral schools, where they learned Latin, basic mathematics, and theology. This education was invaluable in a largely illiterate society, but it came at the price of separation from family and submission to strict religious discipline. For the children of nobles, education took on a different character entirely. Boys were often sent to serve as pages in other noble households, beginning their training in the complex codes of chivalry and warfare. They learned to handle weapons, care for horses, and navigate the intricate social hierarchies of court life. This education was comprehensive but demanding, requiring mastery of everything from swordplay to poetry, from hunting to diplomacy. Noble girls received education focused on managing large households and maintaining the family's social position. They learned to read and write, manage servants, and oversee the complex logistics of running a castle or manor. Some received training in music, embroidery, and other accomplishments deemed appropriate for their station. Yet, even these privileged children faced constraints and expectations that would seem oppressive by modern standards, with marriages arranged for political advantage often determining their entire future by the time they reached adolescence. The medieval guild system provided another layer of structure to children's education and economic development. Guild apprenticeships were highly sought after, offering training in specialized crafts like weaving, goldsmithing, or carpentry. These organizations carefully controlled who could learn their trades, often requiring substantial fees or family connections to gain entry. For those fortunate enough to secure apprenticeships, the guilds provided not just technical training, but also social networks and economic security that could last a lifetime. Yet the guild system also perpetuated inequality, as the children of existing guild members enjoyed significant advantages over outsiders. The fees required for apprenticeships put them out of reach for most peasant families, while the complex social requirements often favored those with existing connections. This created a hereditary class of skilled craftsmen, while excluding many talented children who lacked the proper social background or financial resources. The development of medieval children was also shaped by the constant presence of death and violence in their daily lives. They witnessed public executions, lived through periodic outbreaks of plague, and saw family members succumb to diseases that modern medicine could easily treat. This exposure to mortality from an early age created a psychological resilience that modern children rarely develop, but it also left deep scars that influence their worldview and behavior throughout their lives. Religious instruction played a central role in helping children process these traumatic experiences. The church taught that earthly suffering was temporary, and that those who endured with faith would be rewarded in the afterlife. This framework provided psychological comfort and helped children develop coping mechanisms for dealing with loss and hardship. The ritual calendar of the church also provided structure and meaning to their lives, offering regular celebrations and observances that broke up the monotony of daily survival. The games and entertainment available to medieval children reflected their harsh environment, while also providing necessary psychological relief. Many traditional games taught practical skills. Wrestling prepared boys for combat, while games involving counting or memory helped develop cognitive abilities useful in trade. Storytelling served multiple purposes, preserving cultural knowledge while also providing emotional outlets for processing difficult experiences. Seasonal celebrations offered some of the few opportunities for pure joy in medieval childhood. Harvest festivals, religious holidays, and local fairs provided breaks from routine work and chances for communities to come together. Children might receive simple gifts, perhaps a wooden toy or a sweet treat, and participate in dancing, singing, and games. These celebrations were crucial for psychological well-being, offering hope and connection in lives otherwise dominated by hardship. The transition from childhood to adulthood in medieval society was marked by specific rituals and expectations that varied by social class and region. For peasant children, this transition was often gradual and practical, marked by increasing responsibility rather than formal ceremonies. A boy might be considered a man when he could handle a full day's work in the fields, while a girl achieved adult status upon marriage, or when she could manage a household independently. Noble children experienced more formal rites of passage, such as the ceremony of knighthood for boys or the elaborate ritual surrounding a girl's first formal introduction to court society. These ceremonies marked not just personal milestones, but also the assumption of specific social and economic responsibilities within the complex hierarchies of medieval life. The legal system of medieval Europe reflected these different concepts of childhood and adulthood. Children were generally considered the property of their fathers and had few independent rights. However, the age at which they were considered capable of making decisions or bearing responsibility varied significantly depending on circumstances. A peasant boy might be held responsible for crimes by age 12, while a noble heir might not assume full control of his inheritance until his early 20s. Marriage patterns also reflected the harsh realities of medieval childhood and the transition to adult responsibilities. For most social classes, marriage was an economic arrangement designed to ensure survival and continuation of family lines, rather than a romantic partnership. Girls might be betrothed in childhood and married by their early teens, while boys typically married later after establishing themselves economically. These arrangements were practical responses to high mortality rates and economic uncertainty, though they placed enormous pressure on young people to assume adult responsibilities before they were emotionally or physically ready. The remarkable adaptability of medieval children in the face of these challenges speaks to fundamental human resilience and the power of community support systems. Despite facing hardships that would overwhelm many modern adults, these young people developed practical skills, emotional strength, and social connections that enabled them to survive and even thrive in their difficult world. Their experiences offer profound lessons about human adaptability and the importance of purpose and community in overcoming adversity. As we reflect on these medieval childhoods, we gain perspective on both how far human society has progressed in protecting and nurturing young people, and also on the remarkable strength and potential that exists within every child. Regardless of circumstances, the medieval children who survived their harsh times did so not just through individual determination, but through the development of skills, relationships, and worldviews that equipped them to build the foundations of the modern world we inhabit today. Based on the reference scripts and summary provided, here's part 5 of How Medieval Children Survived Harsh Times. Despite the overwhelming challenges they faced, medieval children possessed a remarkable capacity for resilience and adaptation that would be difficult to comprehend by today's standards. Their survival depended not just on the physical necessities of food and shelter, but on developing an intricate web of relationships, skills, and mental fortitude that would carry them through their often brief but intensely lived lives. The foundation of a medieval child's survival lay in their ability to form and maintain crucial social bonds. While we often think of childhood as a time of carefree play and protection, medieval children understood from their earliest years that their survival depended on being useful, being liked, and being remembered. They learned to read the moods and needs of adults with an almost supernatural intuition, knowing that a well-timed smile, a helpful gesture, or a demonstration of competence could mean the difference between receiving an extra crust of bread or going hungry. Children developed what we might call emotional intelligence at a remarkably young age. They learned to navigate the complex hierarchies of medieval society, understanding instinctively when to speak and when to remain silent, when to make themselves visible and when to disappear into the shadows. A peasant child working in the Lord's manor would quickly learn which servants were kind and which were cruel, which tasks earned praise and which brought punishment. They became experts at reading subtle social cues, understanding that their survival often depended on staying in the good graces of those who held power over their daily lives. The medieval world was one of constant storytelling, and children absorbed these narratives like sponges. They learned not just practical skills from the adults around them, but entire worldviews. Stories of saints who overcame impossible odds, tales of clever peasants who outwitted their betters, and legends of children who saved their families through wit and courage, all became part of their mental toolkit for survival. These stories didn't just entertain. They provided roadmaps for navigating difficult situations and maintaining hope in the face of adversity. Children also developed what we might recognize today as sophisticated coping mechanisms. They learned to find joy in the smallest pleasures, the warmth of sun on their faces during a brief rest from work, the taste of honey when they were lucky enough to encounter it, the companionship of other children during rare moments of play. They developed games that helped them process trauma and fear, often reenacting adult scenarios in ways that gave them a sense of control and mastery over their environment. The religious framework of medieval life, while often oppressive, also provided children with powerful psychological tools for survival. The concept of suffering as meaningful, as something that brought them closer to God and promised reward in the afterlife, helped children endure hardships that might otherwise have broken their spirits. Prayer became not just a religious obligation, but a form of meditation and emotional regulation. The rituals of the church provided structure and predictability in lives that were otherwise chaotic and uncertain. Medieval children also demonstrated remarkable physical adaptability. Their bodies learned to function on minimal nutrition, to work through pain and exhaustion, to recover quickly from injuries that would sideline modern children for weeks. They developed calluses, not just on their hands, but seemingly on their entire beings, becoming toughened by experiences that would traumatize children today. Yet this hardening was selective. They maintained their capacity for love, loyalty, and hope, even as they developed the thick skin necessary for survival. The apprenticeship system, harsh as it often was, provided children with a crucial sense of identity and purpose. A child who became an apprentice blacksmith wasn't just learning to work with metal. They were becoming part of a tradition, joining a community, and building an identity that would sustain them through years of difficult training. The knowledge that their suffering had meaning, that each day brought them closer to mastery and independence, gave them the psychological strength to endure conditions that would seem unbearable to us. Children also learned to find family wherever they could. Orphan children might be taken in by distant relatives, kindly neighbors, or religious institutions. But they quickly learned to create family bonds with whoever showed them kindness. They developed fierce loyalties to those who protected them, and these relationships often lasted throughout their lives. A child who found a mentor in an older craftsman, a protective relationship with an older sibling, or even kindness from a monastery cook would nurture these connections with the intensity that comes from understanding how precious and rare such care truly was. The medieval child's relationship with death and loss was profoundly different from our own. They lived in constant awareness of mortality, having witnessed the deaths of siblings, parents, and friends from their earliest memories. Rather than being traumatized into paralysis by this reality, they developed a matter-of-fact acceptance that allowed them to continue functioning and hoping. They learned to grieve quickly and move forward, not because they felt less pain than we do, but because stopping to process that pain fully would have meant their own destruction. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval children maintained their capacity for joy and wonder despite everything they endured. They found magic in the changing seasons, excitement in festival days, and deep satisfaction in mastering new skills. They formed intense friendships with other children when possible, creating bonds that provided emotional sustenance even in the bleakest circumstances. They learned to steal moments of childhood whenever possible, playing games with stones and sticks, telling stories, and finding ways to laugh even in the midst of hardship. The development of what we might call spiritual resilience was perhaps the most crucial survival skill medieval children possessed. Whether through formal religious practice or through their own intuitive understanding of something greater than themselves, children learned to find meaning in suffering and hope in despair. They developed an inner strength that came from believing their lives had purpose, even when that purpose was simply to survive another day and help their families do the same. These children also learned to think strategically about their futures in ways that modern children rarely need to consider. They understood that their choices in childhood would determine their entire life trajectory, and they made decisions accordingly. A child might endure years of brutal treatment as an apprentice because they understood it was their only path to eventual independence. They learned to save their energy for battles they could win, and to accept with grace the things they could not change. The resourcefulness of medieval children extended beyond mere survival to encompass a kind of creative problem-solving that was born from necessity. They learned to make tools from scraps, to find food in places others overlooked, to create shelter and warmth from whatever materials were available. They developed an intimate knowledge of their environment that allowed them to exploit every possible resource for survival. As we consider the psychological resilience of these remarkable children, we must remember that their strength came not from being naturally tougher than modern children, but from developing these skills because their very survival depended on it. They were not superhuman, they were simply human beings pushed to develop capabilities that most of us will never need. Their legacy reminds us of the incredible adaptability of the human spirit, and the profound capacity children have for growth, learning, and survival when circumstances demand it. The medieval child's journey from helpless infant to capable adult was compressed into a time frame that would shock us today, but it was also supported by a community structure that, despite its many flaws, recognized that children were precious resources whose survival was essential to the continuation of society itself. In learning how these children not only survived, but often thrived, we gain insight into the remarkable resilience that lies dormant within all human beings, waiting to be awakened by necessity and nurtured by hope. Here is part 6 of the 12-part script for how medieval children survived harsh times. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, medieval children possessed an extraordinary capacity for psychological resilience that enabled them to endure unimaginable hardships. In a world where death lurked around every corner, where hunger was a constant companion, and where violence erupted without warning, these young souls developed mental fortifications that would astound modern psychologists. The foundation of their resilience lay in acceptance of their circumstances. Unlike children today, who might rebel against harsh conditions, medieval children understood from their earliest memories that suffering was simply the natural order of things. They did not question why life was difficult, because they had no frame of reference for anything else. This acceptance, while perhaps heartbreaking to our modern sensibilities, actually served as a protective psychological mechanism that allowed them to function and even thrive within their harsh reality. Medieval children learned early that emotional regulation was not a luxury, but a survival skill. A child who could control their fear when bandits approached the village, who could suppress their hunger pangs during times of scarcity, and who could remain calm during violent outbursts had a significantly better chance of survival. They developed what we might today call emotional intelligence, through necessity rather than instruction. One of the most remarkable aspects of their psychological development was their ability to compartmentalize trauma. When a sibling died from disease, when their father was killed in battle, or when their home was burned by raiders, medieval children possessed an almost supernatural ability to process these events and continue functioning. They understood that grief was a luxury they could not afford for long. Instead, they channeled their emotions into productive activities, whether helping their mothers with household tasks or learning new survival skills. The concept of childhood as a protected, innocent phase of life simply did not exist in medieval society. Children were viewed as small adults who needed to contribute to family survival from the moment they could walk. This perspective, while harsh by today's standards, actually provided these young people with a sense of purpose and importance that bolstered their psychological well-being. A 6-year-old who successfully scared birds away from the grain fields or helped deliver a calf felt genuine pride in their contribution to family survival. Medieval children also developed sophisticated coping mechanisms through storytelling and imagination. In the long winter evenings when families gathered around meager fires, children would listen to tales of heroes, saints, and magical creatures. These stories served multiple psychological functions. They provided escape from immediate hardships, offered moral frameworks for understanding their world, and gave them models of resilience and courage to emulate. The oral tradition was particularly powerful in shaping young minds. Children heard stories of saints who endured terrible sufferings with grace, of knights who faced impossible odds with courage, and of ordinary people who survived extraordinary hardships through faith and determination. These narratives became psychological templates that helped children understand their own struggles as part of a larger human experience. Religious faith played a crucial role in their psychological resilience. The promise of eternal reward for earthly suffering gave meaning to their hardships. Children learned to view their trials not as meaningless cruelty, but as tests of faith that would ultimately lead to salvation. This framework provided them with a sense of agency even in the most powerless situations. They could choose how to respond to suffering, and that choice had eternal significance. The development of what modern psychologists might call grit or perseverance was perhaps the most essential psychological trait these children cultivated. They learned that giving up was simply not an option. When faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, they developed an almost instinctive ability to break problems down into manageable pieces and tackle them one step at a time. A child faced with gathering enough firewood for winter would not be overwhelmed by the enormity of the task, but would focus on collecting one bundle at a time, day after day, until the job was done. Medieval children also displayed remarkable adaptability in their thinking patterns. They learned to quickly assess new situations and adjust their behavior accordingly. A child who could read the mood of a drunken father and know when to hide, who could recognize the signs of approaching illness and take preventive measures, or who could sense the political tensions in their village and navigate them safely, had mastered skills that went far beyond their years. The peer relationships among medieval children were characterized by intense loyalty and mutual support. They understood that their survival often depended on the strength of their relationships with siblings and friends. This led to the development of strong social bonds that could withstand enormous stress. Children learned to share resources without being asked, to keep each other's secrets, and to provide comfort during times of crisis. Interestingly, medieval children often displayed what we might recognize today as post-traumatic growth, the ability to find meaning and strength through adversity. Children who survived famines often developed a deep appreciation for food and hospitality that lasted their entire lives. Those who lived through violent conflicts often became particularly skilled at conflict resolution and peacekeeping. The hardships they endured, rather than simply damaging them, often forged them into individuals with extraordinary emotional depth and wisdom. The development of practical intelligence was another crucial aspect of their psychological adaptation. Medieval children learned to think strategically about survival in ways that would be remarkable in any era. They could assess the relative safety of different hiding places, judge the character of strangers with uncanny accuracy, and make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. This practical intelligence was honed through constant exposure to real-world consequences, where mistakes could be fatal. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval children maintained the capacity for joy and wonder despite their harsh circumstances. They found delight in simple pleasures, a successful harvest, a warm, sunny day, a rare treat of honey or fruit. They celebrated small victories with an intensity that reflected their understanding of how precious such moments were. This ability to extract happiness from minimal resources was perhaps their greatest psychological asset. The relationships between medieval children and their parents were complex, but generally characterized by deep mutual dependence and respect. Children understood that their parents were doing everything possible to ensure their survival, often at great personal sacrifice. This understanding fostered a sense of gratitude and responsibility that strengthened family bonds even under extreme stress. Parents, in turn, recognized that their children's survival skills and emotional maturity were essential to the family's well-being. Medieval children also developed sophisticated risk assessment abilities. They learned to constantly evaluate their environment for potential threats and opportunities. A child walking through the forest would automatically note which plants were edible, which paths were safest, where fresh water might be found, and what signs might indicate the presence of dangerous animals or hostile humans. This heightened awareness became second nature and served them well throughout their lives. The concept of learned helplessness, which modern psychology recognizes as a significant barrier to resilience, was virtually unknown among medieval children. They were taught from earliest childhood that their actions mattered, that their efforts could make a difference in their family's survival, and that passivity was a luxury they could not afford. This sense of agency, even in the face of overwhelming odds, was perhaps the cornerstone of their psychological resilience. Medieval children also learned to find meaning in suffering itself. Through religious teaching and cultural tradition, they came to understand that hardship could be transformative, that struggle could build character, and that endurance in the face of adversity was among the highest virtues. This framework allowed them to maintain psychological equilibrium even during periods of extreme difficulty. The social structures of medieval society, while often harsh and unforgiving, also provided children with clear expectations and roles that gave their lives structure and meaning. They knew what was expected of them, understood the consequences of their actions, and could see how their individual efforts contributed to the larger community. This clarity of purpose was psychologically stabilizing in ways that the more ambiguous expectations of modern childhood cannot match. As these children matured, they carried forward the psychological tools they had developed through necessity. They became adults with an extraordinary capacity for endurance, an appreciation for life's simple pleasures, and a deep understanding of human nature, forged through years of navigating complex and dangerous social situations. Their childhood experiences, while undeniably harsh, had equipped them with psychological resources that served them well throughout their lives and enabled them to pass on their resilience to the next generation. The legacy of their psychological adaptation can still be seen today in cultures that maintain strong traditions of resilience and community support. The mental toughness, emotional intelligence, and practical wisdom that medieval children developed through necessity remain valuable human qualities that continue to serve us well in facing the challenges of any era. How medieval children survived harsh times. Part 7. Children in medieval times didn't just survive harsh conditions through sheer luck or chance. They developed sophisticated psychological coping mechanisms that modern researchers are only beginning to understand. While their bodies endured physical hardships we've already explored, their minds created intricate defense systems that allowed them to process trauma, find meaning in suffering, and maintain hope, even in the darkest circumstances. One of the most remarkable adaptations was their ability to compartmentalize experiences. Medieval children learned early to separate immediate survival needs from emotional processing. When faced with the death of siblings, which happened with devastating frequency, children would continue their daily tasks while internally creating what we might now call emotional buffers. They didn't have the luxury of extended grieving periods that modern psychology recognizes as necessary, so they developed rapid emotional cycling techniques. Take the example of Agnes, a 12-year-old girl living in 14th century England during one of the recurring plague outbreaks. Historical records from her village show that she lost 3 younger siblings within a single month. Yet chronicles indicate she continued helping her mother with daily bread making, tending to the family's single goat, and caring for her remaining baby brother. Modern trauma specialists studying medieval accounts suggest children like Agnes developed what they term active dissociation, maintaining functionality while processing grief in small, manageable fragments during quiet moments. This emotional compartmentalization wasn't callousness or numbness. Instead, it represented a sophisticated survival mechanism that allowed children to remain functional caregivers for younger siblings or elderly relatives while still honoring their losses. They would often create private rituals, small moments of remembrance woven into daily activities. Agnes might whisper a prayer for her deceased siblings while kneading dough, or save a small portion of her meager meal as a symbolic offering. Medieval children also developed remarkable pattern recognition skills that served as early warning systems for danger. Living in environments where threats could emerge suddenly, from raiders, wild animals, disease outbreaks, or even the unpredictable moods of feudal lords, children became experts at reading subtle environmental and social cues. They learned to interpret the quality of silence, the way adults held their shoulders, changes in daily routines that might signal approaching trouble. Young children would memorize the sounds of normal daily life so completely that any deviation immediately caught their attention. The absence of morning bird songs might indicate predators nearby. Unusual quiet from neighboring households could signal illness. Changes in the way their parents spoke to each other, even in hushed tones, would alert children to prepare for potential upheaval. This hypervigilance while exhausting, became a crucial survival tool that many children maintained throughout their lives. They also developed sophisticated social intelligence that helped them navigate the complex hierarchies and alliances within their communities. Medieval children learned to read not just their immediate family dynamics, but the broader social networks that could mean the difference between protection and vulnerability. They understood which neighbors could be trusted for help, which local officials might show mercy, and how to present themselves to minimize punishment when things went wrong. Perhaps most importantly, medieval children developed what modern psychologists might recognize as a form of meaning-making that helped them find purpose in suffering. Unlike modern children, who are often shielded from life's harsher realities, medieval children were full participants in their families' survival efforts from very young ages. This created a sense of agency and contribution that paradoxically helped them cope with circumstances largely beyond their control. Children found profound meaning in small acts of care and protection. An 8-year-old boy might take fierce pride in successfully foraging enough nuts to supplement his family's winter stores. A 10-year-old girl might find deep satisfaction in successfully treating a neighbor's wound with herbs she had learned to identify and prepare. These contributions weren't just busy work or token responsibilities. They were genuinely vital to their families' and communities' survival. This sense of meaningful contribution created what resilience researchers now call purpose-driven coping. When children felt their efforts mattered, they were better able to endure hardships because those hardships had context and meaning. They weren't suffering randomly, but rather enduring difficulties as part of their role in keeping their loved ones alive and their communities functioning. Medieval children also developed sophisticated spiritual and philosophical frameworks for understanding suffering that provided remarkable psychological resilience. Unlike modern secular approaches to trauma, which often focus on individual healing and recovery, medieval children were taught to view hardship through religious and communal lenses that helped them find meaning in pain. They learned to see their suffering as temporary tests of faith that would be rewarded in the afterlife. But more immediately, they learned to view endurance itself as a form of strength and virtue. This wasn't passive acceptance, but rather an active embrace of their role as survivors and protectors. Children would often adopt specific saints as personal protectors, creating intimate spiritual relationships that provided comfort and guidance during difficult times. The story of Thomas, a young boy from a 15th century Scottish village, illustrates this spiritual resilience beautifully. After losing both parents to disease when he was 9 years old, Thomas was taken in by his elderly grandmother who could barely care for herself. Rather than becoming bitter or despairing, Thomas adopted Saint Christopher as his patron saint and began to see himself as his grandmother's protector on their journey through hardship toward eventual heavenly reunion with his parents. This spiritual framework gave Thomas a sense of mission and identity that helped him endure years of near starvation and social marginalization. He would often be found praying not for his suffering to end, but for strength to continue protecting his grandmother until she too could join his parents in paradise. When his grandmother finally died when Thomas was 14, villagers reported that he seemed almost joyful, speaking of how he had successfully completed his sacred duty as her guardian. Medieval children also developed remarkable capacity for finding joy and celebration in the smallest pleasures. Because their baseline existence was so harsh, moments of abundance or beauty became intensely meaningful. A successful harvest, a warm sunny day, a piece of honey, a song sung by traveling minstrels. These experiences weren't just pleasant diversions, but profound sources of renewal and hope. Children learned to amplify these positive experiences, storing them as psychological resources for harder times. They would often create elaborate mental catalogues of beautiful or joyful moments, revisiting them during periods of particular hardship. A child might sustain themselves through a brutal winter by repeatedly recalling the taste of fresh strawberries from the previous summer, or the sound of laughter during a harvest celebration. This wasn't simple nostalgia, but rather a sophisticated psychological tool for maintaining hope and perspective. By consciously savoring positive experiences and storing them for future psychological nourishment, children created internal resources that helped them survive periods when external circumstances offered little comfort. The development of these psychological survival mechanisms wasn't without cost. Many medieval children likely suffered from what we would now recognize as various forms of trauma-related stress. However, their coping strategies were remarkably effective at maintaining functionality and even finding paths to growth and meaning within extremely challenging circumstances. Modern trauma researchers studying historical accounts of medieval childhood have identified several key factors that contributed to children's psychological resilience. First, their roles as genuine contributors to family survival created a sense of agency and purpose that helped buffer against feelings of helplessness. Second, their deep integration into community networks provided multiple sources of support and identity beyond just their immediate families. Third, their spiritual frameworks offered both comfort and meaning-making structures that helped them interpret suffering in constructive ways. Perhaps most significantly, medieval children developed what researchers call collective resilience, the ability to draw strength not just from individual coping mechanisms, but from their roles within larger survival networks. They understood that their personal endurance contributed to their families' and communities' survival, which gave their suffering broader meaning and purpose. This collective approach to resilience helped children develop psychological flexibility and adaptability that served them throughout their lives. They learned to shift between different roles and identities as circumstances required, sometimes being vulnerable children who needed care, sometimes being capable workers contributing to family survival, sometimes being spiritual beings connected to larger cosmic purposes. The legacy of these medieval psychological adaptations extended far beyond individual survival. Children who developed these coping mechanisms often became the foundation of their community's long-term resilience. They grew into adults who could lead others through hardship, who could maintain hope and purpose during difficult times, and who could pass on both practical survival skills and psychological coping strategies to the next generation. Understanding how medieval children developed and maintained psychological resilience offers valuable insights for modern approaches to child development and trauma recovery. While we certainly wouldn't want to subject modern children to medieval hardships, there's much to learn from the sophisticated coping mechanisms these young people developed. Their emphasis on meaningful contribution, community connection, spiritual grounding, and the conscious cultivation of joy and hope provides a template for building resilience that remains relevant today. Modern children facing various forms of adversity might benefit from approaches that help them find genuine ways to contribute to others' well-being, that connect them to larger communities and purposes, and that teach them to consciously savor and store positive experiences for future psychological nourishment. The medieval child's ability to find meaning in suffering, to maintain hope in desperate circumstances, and to continue caring for others even while enduring personal hardship represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. These children didn't just survive harsh times, they created the psychological and social foundations that allowed entire civilizations to persist through centuries of hardship and eventually build the more prosperous and stable societies we inherit today. Their legacy reminds us that human resilience isn't just about individual strength or external circumstances, but about the sophisticated psychological and spiritual frameworks we create to find meaning, purpose, and hope, even in the most challenging times. The medieval child's journey through hardship wasn't just about survival. It was about the creation of wisdom, strength, and compassion that would echo through generations, ultimately contributing to humanity's long journey toward greater security, prosperity, and understanding. Based on the extensive content you've provided, I'll continue the script for Part 8 of How Medieval Children Survived Harsh Times. Here's the continuation. Medieval children's survival depended not only on their individual resilience, but on the intricate web of community bonds that held their world together. In an age where institutional support was virtually non-existent, the extended family network became the primary safety net that could mean the difference between life and death for a vulnerable child. The medieval household was rarely just a nuclear family. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and even unrelated servants and apprentices all lived under one roof or in close proximity. This created a complex support system where multiple adults shared responsibility for child rearing. When parents died, which happened with alarming frequency, children didn't automatically become orphans in the modern sense. Instead, they were absorbed into this extended network, taken in by relatives who understood that today's act of charity might be tomorrow's necessity for their own offspring. Children learned early that survival meant understanding their place within these intricate social webs. They observed how their parents navigated relationships with neighbors, how debts of gratitude were carefully maintained, and how alliances were formed and preserved. A child who helped an elderly neighbor with daily tasks wasn't just being kind, they were investing in their family's social capital. These relationships could prove crucial when times got hard, when crops failed, or when illness struck the household. The concept of mutual aid was deeply embedded in medieval communities. Children witnessed their parents participating in collective activities like barn raising, harvest gatherings, and communal food preparation. They learned that individual families rarely survived alone, that prosperity and hardship were shared experiences. When one family's cow died, neighbors would provide milk. When someone fell ill during harvest time, others would gather their crops. Children absorbed these lessons about reciprocity and interdependence, understanding that their survival was tied to the survival of their entire community. Religious communities provided another crucial layer of support for medieval children. The church wasn't just a place of worship, but a center of social services. Monasteries and convents operated orphanages, schools, and hospitals. Children learned that the church could provide sanctuary in times of crisis, food during famines, and education for those lucky enough to access it. Many children found their path to survival through religious institutions, either as students, servants, or novices preparing for religious life. The guild system offered another form of community support, particularly for children in urban areas. Craft guilds weren't just professional organizations, but social networks that cared for their members' families. When a master craftsman died, his guild often ensured his children were provided for, either by supporting the widow's continued operation of the business or by placing children as apprentices with other guild members. Children learned that professional communities could provide security and opportunity, that mastering a trade meant joining a brotherhood that would support them throughout their lives. Medieval children also developed sophisticated strategies for building their own support networks. They formed friendships that crossed social boundaries when possible, understanding that diverse connections offered different types of security. A peasant child might befriend the baker's daughter, creating access to bread during difficult times. A merchant's son might cultivate relationships with children from noble families, potentially opening doors to advancement opportunities later in life. These children became adept at reading social dynamics and positioning themselves advantageously within community hierarchies. They learned to identify who held real power versus who merely appeared powerful, who could be trusted in a crisis, and who might provide opportunities for advancement. This social intelligence was as crucial for survival as any practical skill, requiring children to develop emotional maturity far beyond their years. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created natural opportunities for community bonding that children participated in from an early age. Spring planting, summer festivals, autumn harvests, and winter celebrations all required collective effort and provided occasions for strengthening social ties. Children learned that their individual survival was woven into these larger community cycles, that their family's well-being depended on maintaining good relationships with neighbors throughout the year. During times of crisis, these community bonds were tested and strengthened. When plague struck a village, surviving children often found themselves cared for by families who had lost their own offspring. When armies passed through, destroying crops and killing livestock, communities had to pull together to ensure everyone survived the aftermath. Children who had invested in these relationships, who had proven themselves helpful and trustworthy, were more likely to receive the support they needed during these critical moments. The legal system of medieval Europe also recognized the importance of community responsibility for children. Laws existed requiring communities to care for orphan children, though enforcement was often inconsistent. Villages had obligations to ensure that abandoned or orphaned children were provided with basic necessities and training in useful skills. Children learned to navigate these systems, understanding their rights and knowing how to appeal to community leaders when necessary. Medieval children developed remarkable skills in negotiating between different community groups and mediating conflicts. Living in small, interconnected communities where disputes could quickly escalate into violence, children learned the arts of diplomacy and peacekeeping. They served as messengers between feuding families, helped arrange reconciliations, and sometimes acted as neutral parties in disputes. These skills not only helped maintain community harmony, but also positioned children as valuable mediators, earning them protection and support from multiple factions. The apprenticeship system represented one of the most important community-based survival strategies for medieval children. Beginning as young as 7 years old, children would be placed with master craftsmen or merchants, leaving their birth families to join new household communities. This system distributed the burden of child rearing across society, while ensuring that children learned valuable skills. Successful apprentices could eventually become masters themselves, gaining economic independence and the ability to support their own extended networks. These community survival strategies weren't without their challenges and contradictions. Children had to navigate competing loyalties and conflicting expectations. The interests of their birth family might clash with those of their apprentice master or religious community. Children learned to balance these competing demands while maintaining their position within multiple social networks. A delicate dance that required considerable emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. The storytelling traditions that flourished in medieval communities served multiple functions for child survival. Beyond entertainment, these stories transmitted crucial information about navigating social relationships, identifying trustworthy individuals, and understanding the consequences of various choices. Children learned through tales about characters who succeeded or failed based on their ability to build and maintain community connections. These narratives provided roadmaps for social behavior and survival strategies disguised as entertainment. Medieval children also participated in economic networks that strengthened community bonds. They engaged in small-scale trading, exchanging goods and services that helped bind families together through mutual dependence. A child might trade eggs from their family's chickens for vegetables from a neighbor's garden, creating economic relationships that provided security for both families. These early experiences in commerce taught children about negotiation, trust, and the importance of maintaining good business relationships within their community. The seasonal migration patterns common in medieval Europe created opportunities for children to build extended networks beyond their immediate communities. Families often traveled for work, trade, or religious pilgrimages, and children formed connections with peers from distant villages. These far-flung relationships could prove invaluable during times of local crisis, providing alternative sources of support or even new places to live if circumstances at home became unbearable. As medieval children matured, they understood that their survival strategies would eventually need to transition from receiving community support to providing it. They prepared for this role by observing how successful adults maintained their networks, contributed to community welfare, and positioned themselves as valuable members of society. This forward-thinking approach to relationship building demonstrated the sophisticated planning abilities that medieval children developed in response to their precarious circumstances. The legacy of these community-based survival strategies extended far beyond childhood. Medieval adults who had learned to navigate complex social networks as children became the leaders, merchants, craftsmen, and religious figures who shaped their societies. Their understanding of mutual aid, reciprocity, and collective responsibility influenced the development of institutions that would eventually evolve into modern social welfare systems. The survival skills that medieval children developed out of necessity became the foundation for more stable and supportive communities that could better protect future generations. In examining how medieval children survived through community bonds and social networks, we see evidence of humanity's fundamental understanding that individual survival depends on collective strength. These children, facing challenges that would overwhelm most modern adults, developed sophisticated strategies for building and maintaining the relationships that kept them alive. Their success in creating supportive communities, despite the harsh realities of their time, demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of the human spirit and the enduring power of social connection as a survival strategy. Based on your previous script content and the reference materials, here's part 9 of your 12-part series. Medieval children faced an unforgiving world where survival demanded not just physical resilience, but remarkable emotional and psychological strength. In the shadows of plague-ravaged villages and war-torn landscapes, these young souls developed coping mechanisms that would astound modern psychologists. They learned to compartmentalize trauma with a sophistication that belied their years, finding ways to process the unthinkable horrors that surrounded them daily. Consider young Eleanor, a blacksmith's daughter in 14th century Yorkshire. By age 7, she had witnessed 3 of her siblings perish from disease, watched her village burn during a Scottish raid, and survived 2 brutal famines that left entire families as hollow-eyed spectres. Yet Eleanor did not simply endure these experiences, she adapted to them in ways that reveal the extraordinary psychological flexibility of medieval children. When death visited her household, Eleanor learned to create what we might call emotional compartments. She would honor her grief in the moments when survival allowed, but then carefully store that pain away when immediate action was required. This wasn't emotional numbness, it was strategic psychological survival. She developed rituals around loss that helped her process trauma while maintaining the mental clarity necessary for daily survival. During times of acute danger, Eleanor and children like her learned to enter what modern trauma specialists might recognize as a state of hypervigilant calm. They could simultaneously remain alert to threats while maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary to function. When raiders approached the village, Eleanor could help her mother hide the family's meager possessions while keeping her younger brother quiet, all while maintaining an almost supernatural awareness of every sound and movement around them. The medieval child's relationship with faith provided another crucial psychological anchor. Unlike the complex theological debates that occupied learned clerics, children developed a deeply personal and practical spirituality. They created mental frameworks where God's will explained the inexplicable, where suffering had meaning, and where their own survival carried divine purpose. This wasn't passive resignation, but active psychological construction of meaning from chaos. Eleanor would whisper prayers not just for protection, but for the strength to endure whatever came next. She developed personal relationships with saints who seemed to understand children's particular struggles. Saint Nicholas for protection, Saint Agatha for healing, Saint Christopher for safe journeys. These weren't distant theological concepts, but intimate psychological allies who helped her navigate an uncertain world. Medieval children also demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence in their relationships with adults. They learned to read the subtle signs of adult stress, fear, and desperation, adjusting their own behavior accordingly. Eleanor could sense when her father returned from market with news of war approaching, not from his words, but from the set of his shoulders and the way he avoided her mother's eyes. She learned to become smaller, quieter, more helpful in these moments, instinctively understanding that adult emotional stability was crucial to her own survival. They developed sophisticated strategies for managing their own emotional needs within these constraints. Eleanor might save her questions about why God allowed babies to die for moments when her mother seemed strongest. She learned to seek comfort indirectly, perhaps by helping with tasks that required close physical proximity, gaining the human contact she needed while providing valuable assistance. The psychological resilience of medieval children also manifested in their remarkable ability to find joy and wonder despite overwhelming hardship. Eleanor could experience genuine delight in small treasures, a smooth stone from the river, a fragment of colored glass, a moment when her father sang while working. These weren't desperate attempts to ignore reality, but authentic experiences of beauty that coexisted with full awareness of life's harshness. Medieval children developed what we might call anticipatory resilience, psychological frameworks that prepared them for likely future hardships. Eleanor knew that hunger would return, that people she loved would probably die, that safety was always temporary. Rather than living in constant dread of these realities, she developed mental models that incorporated them as natural parts of existence. This allowed her to appreciate good times fully, while remaining psychologically prepared for difficulties. They also learned to process collective trauma in ways that strengthened rather than weakened community bonds. When plague swept through Eleanor's village, the surviving children didn't retreat into isolation, but instead formed even tighter connections with the adults and other children who remained. They developed shared rituals for remembering the dead, collective strategies for managing fear, and group activities that reinforced their sense of belonging to something larger than their individual suffering. The medieval child's psychological toolkit included remarkable skills in reading environmental cues and making rapid assessments of safety and danger. Eleanor could evaluate a stranger's intentions from their posture and clothing, determine whether unusual sounds indicated immediate threat or distant activity, and assess whether changes in adult behavior suggested specific types of danger. These weren't just survival skills, but complex psychological processes that required constant mental engagement and sophisticated pattern recognition. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval children developed what we might call transformative meaning-making abilities. They could take experiences that would devastate modern children and transform them into sources of strength and wisdom. Eleanor's experience of famine taught her not just about hunger, but about the preciousness of food, the importance of sharing, and the strength that comes from enduring hardship alongside others. Her experience of loss taught her about the fragility of life, but also about the intensity of love and the importance of cherishing relationships while they lasted. These children also developed sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and power structures that helped them navigate complex hierarchical relationships. Eleanor understood that her survival might depend on gaining favor with the Lord's steward, that her family's safety could be influenced by maintaining good relationships with neighbors, and that her own future opportunities might depend on demonstrations of useful skills and good character. She learned to present herself appropriately in different social contexts while maintaining her core sense of identity. The psychological resilience of medieval children extended to their ability to maintain hope and agency, even in circumstances that offered little apparent control. Eleanor might not be able to prevent plague or famine, but she could perfect her spinning skills, learn herb lore from her grandmother, and develop relationships that might prove valuable in future crises. She maintained a sense of personal efficacy by focusing on the aspects of her life she could influence, while accepting with remarkable grace the vast areas beyond her control. Medieval children's emotional intelligence also included sophisticated understanding of timing and context. Eleanor knew when it was appropriate to express fear, when tears would be welcome versus burdensome, and when courage needed to be displayed regardless of her internal state. She learned to calibrate her emotional expressions to maximize both her own psychological health and her social effectiveness. These young people developed remarkably nuanced understanding of risk assessment and decision-making under uncertainty. Eleanor could weigh the risks of traveling to market during unsettled times against the benefits of trading for needed supplies. She learned to make quick decisions based on incomplete information, while remaining flexible enough to change course as new information became available. The psychological adaptations of medieval children also included sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining motivation and purpose in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Eleanor found meaning in contributing to her family's survival, in learning skills that would serve her throughout life, and in maintaining the cultural traditions that connected her to previous generations and future possibilities. She developed internal narratives that cast her struggles as meaningful parts of larger stories rather than random suffering. Medieval children's emotional resilience was also supported by their deep integration into multi-generational communities, where their experiences were validated and contextualized by adults who had survived similar hardships. Eleanor's grandmother could acknowledge the reality of her fears, while also sharing stories of previous generations who had endured and overcome similar challenges. This provided both emotional support and practical models for survival and recovery. These remarkable young people developed psychological skills that modern trauma therapists spend years learning to teach. They understood intuitively how to ground themselves in present moment awareness when anxiety about the future threatened to overwhelm them. They knew how to use physical activity, creative expression, and social connection as tools for emotional regulation. They developed personal rituals and practices that helped them maintain psychological equilibrium in chaotic circumstances. The mental fortitude displayed by medieval children like Eleanor represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in psychological adaptation. These young people didn't simply survive their harsh circumstances. They developed into emotionally intelligent, resilient adults who could create meaning, maintain relationships, and find joy, even while fully acknowledging life's difficulties. Their example reminds us that human psychological capacity for growth and adaptation, even in childhood, far exceeds what we often imagine possible. Their legacy lives on in the fundamental human capacity for resilience, the ability to find strength in community, and the understanding that psychological survival requires not the absence of pain, but the development of tools for transforming suffering into wisdom, isolation into connection, and despair into hope. Medieval children possessed remarkable survival skills and adaptive strategies that enabled them to endure some of history's most challenging circumstances. Their resilience wasn't merely a product of chance, but rather the result of sophisticated coping mechanisms, strong community bonds, and an extraordinary capacity for adaptation that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. The foundation of childhood survival in medieval times rested on the principle of collective responsibility. Unlike our modern concept of nuclear family isolation, medieval children were embedded within extensive networks of kinship and community support. when parents perished from disease or warfare, which happened with alarming frequency, children rarely faced abandonment. Instead, they were absorbed into the households of relatives, neighbors, or even strangers who understood that community survival depended on caring for the young. This social safety net, while imperfect, prevented the complete dissolution of childhood that might otherwise have occurred during times of crisis. Medieval children developed what we might call adaptive intelligence far earlier than their modern counterparts. By age 5 or 6, most children possessed practical skills that would be considered advanced by today's standards. They could identify edible plants, understand weather patterns, assist with livestock care, and contribute meaningfully to household production. This wasn't child labor in the exploitative sense we might imagine, but rather a systematic integration into community life that provided children with purpose, skills, and social value. Their contributions weren't merely tolerated, but genuinely needed, giving them a sense of agency and importance that bolstered their psychological resilience. The medieval approach to childhood education, while lacking formal schooling for most, emphasized experiential learning that proved remarkably effective for survival. Children learned through observation, imitation, and gradual participation in adult activities. This apprenticeship model of learning created deep, practical knowledge that served them throughout their lives. A blacksmith's child didn't just watch metalwork, but understood the properties of different metals, the behavior of fire, and the mechanics of tools. A farmer's child could read the subtle signs of weather change, soil quality, and animal behavior. This comprehensive, hands-on education created children who were remarkably competent and self-reliant. Perhaps most importantly, medieval children developed sophisticated emotional and psychological coping mechanisms that enabled them to process trauma and uncertainty. They lived in a world where death was visible and commonplace, where security was temporary, and where hardship was expected rather than exceptional. Rather than being emotionally damaged by this reality, many children developed what researchers now recognize as post-traumatic growth, the ability to find meaning, strength, and wisdom in adversity. Medieval children learned to compartmentalize emotional pain while maintaining hope for the future. They developed strong spiritual frameworks that provided meaning for suffering and death. Whether through Christian teachings about divine providence or folk beliefs about fate and fortune, children possessed explanatory systems that helped them make sense of chaos and loss. These belief systems weren't mere superstition, but functional psychological tools that provided comfort, guidance, and resilience. The storytelling traditions of medieval culture played a crucial role in childhood survival by providing both entertainment and psychological preparation for life's challenges. Children heard tales of heroes overcoming impossible odds, of ordinary people showing extraordinary courage, and of communities surviving through cooperation and ingenuity. These stories weren't just entertainment, but cognitive rehearsals for real-life challenges, teaching children problem-solving strategies, moral frameworks, and emotional regulation techniques. Medieval children also benefited from what we might call distributed caregiving, the understanding that child rearing was a community responsibility rather than solely a parental one. Master craftsmen took apprentices not just for economic reasons, but out of social obligation. Religious institutions provided education and care for orphaned children. Even wealthy households often took in children from poorer families, creating opportunities for social mobility and skill development. This system meant that children had multiple adult figures to learn from and rely upon, reducing their vulnerability to the loss of any single caregiver. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life provided children with predictable patterns that created psychological stability even amid uncertainty. The agricultural calendar, religious festivals, and community celebrations created a structured temporal framework that helped children understand their place in the larger cycle of life. These rhythms provided anticipation of positive events, opportunities for community bonding, and markers of personal growth and achievement. Medieval children developed remarkable physical resilience through constant exposure to environmental challenges. While this exposure certainly resulted in higher childhood mortality rates, those who survived often possessed extraordinary physical capabilities. They could walk long distances, endure temperature extremes, survive on minimal nutrition, and recover from injuries that might incapacitate modern children. This physical hardiness wasn't just biological adaptation, but reflected sophisticated knowledge of herbal medicine, nutrition, and self-care passed down through generations. The economic integration of children into medieval society, while harsh by modern standards, provided them with valuable skills and social connections that enhanced their survival prospects. Children who worked in various capacities learned not just specific trades, but developed understanding of markets, social hierarchies, and economic relationships. They formed networks of peers and mentors that could provide support, opportunities, and protection throughout their lives. Medieval children also demonstrated remarkable creativity and resourcefulness in finding joy and meaning despite difficult circumstances. They created games from simple materials, found wonder in natural phenomena, and developed rich imaginative lives that provided psychological escape and emotional nourishment. Their ability to find pleasure in small things, a sweet fruit, a warm fire, a song or story, reflected sophisticated emotional regulation skills that modern psychology recognizes as crucial for mental health. The religious and spiritual frameworks available to medieval children provided powerful coping mechanisms for dealing with uncertainty and loss. Whether through formal religious instruction or folk spiritual practices, children learned to see themselves as part of larger cosmic narratives that gave meaning to suffering and hope for redemption. These frameworks weren't merely abstract beliefs, but practical psychological tools that helped children process trauma, maintain hope, and find purpose in difficult circumstances. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval children developed strong senses of personal agency despite living in societies that offered limited individual freedom. They learned to identify opportunities for choice and action within constrained circumstances, to advocate for themselves when possible, and to adapt creatively to changing situations. This psychological flexibility proved crucial for survival in an unpredictable world. The survival strategies developed by medieval children reflected sophisticated understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and practical skills that enabled them not merely to endure, but often to thrive in circumstances that would challenge even modern adults. Their resilience emerged not from luck or genetics alone, but from comprehensive adaptive strategies that modern research is revealing to be remarkably sophisticated and effective. These children weren't simply victims of harsh circumstances, but active agents in their own survival, developing skills and perspectives that often served them well throughout their lives and contributed to the overall resilience of medieval society. Here's the script for part 11 of How Medieval Children Survived Harsh Times. The bonds that held medieval children together extended far beyond their immediate families. In this harsh world where death stalked every doorway and famine threatened with each failed harvest, children learned early that survival depended not just on individual resilience, but on the strength of collective networks that could weather any storm. These networks formed the invisible scaffolding that supported young lives through their most vulnerable years. The guild system represented one of the most powerful protective structures available to medieval children. When a master craftsman took on an apprentice, he wasn't simply acquiring cheap labor. He was entering into a sacred covenant that bound him to treat that child as his own son. The guild regulations were explicit about this responsibility. A master who failed to properly feed, clothe, or educate his apprentice faced heavy fines and expulsion from the guild. More importantly, if the master died, the guild itself became responsible for the apprentice's welfare. ensuring the child would not be cast adrift in a world that showed little mercy to the defenseless. Young Thomas, apprenticed to a blacksmith in Winchester at age 12, experienced this protection firsthand when his master succumbed to fever in the winter of his 3rd year. Rather than finding himself homeless and friendless, Thomas discovered that the guild had already arranged for him to continue his training with another master. The guild even provided a small sum to cover his immediate needs, drawn from the collective fund that all members contributed to precisely for such emergencies. This wasn't charity in the modern sense, but rather a practical recognition that the guild's strength lay in its ability to protect and nurture its future members. The religious institutions of medieval Europe created another crucial safety net for children. Monasteries and convents served as sanctuaries where orphaned or abandoned children could find not just shelter, but education and purpose. The Abbey of St. Albans, for instance, maintained a school that educated both oblates, children given to religious life by their families, and day students from the surrounding area. Brother Augustine, the Abbey's schoolmaster, often remarked that teaching these children was not merely an act of charity, but a recognition that knowledge itself was a form of protection against the uncertainties of the world. For children like Margaret, whose parents died in a plague outbreak when she was only 8 years old, the convent of St. Mary became more than a refuge. It became the foundation for a life that would have been impossible in the secular world. The nuns taught her to read and write, skills that fewer than 1 in 20 women possessed outside religious communities. They instructed her in herb lore and healing arts, knowledge that would make her valuable and respected wherever she might go. Most importantly, they showed her that a woman could have agency and authority in a world that typically offered neither to her sex. The extended family networks of medieval society created yet another layer of protection for children. When parents died or became incapacitated, the responsibility for their children didn't fall to charitable institutions, but to the broader family unit. Uncles, aunts, godparents, and even distant cousins understood that child-rearing was a collective responsibility. This wasn't merely cultural tradition, but economic necessity in a world where every hand was needed for survival. Consider the case of the de Clare family in rural Yorkshire. When William de Clare was killed in a farming accident, leaving behind his wife Eleanor and 3 young children, the response was immediate and comprehensive. William's brother Robert took in the eldest son to work his fields and learn farming. Eleanor's sister provided a home for the youngest daughter, while the middle child went to live with his godfather, a prosperous wool merchant who could provide opportunities for advancement. Eleanor herself was supported by the extended family until she could remarry, ensuring that the children maintained connection with their mother while receiving the protection and education they needed. These arrangements weren't always harmonious. Children in such situations often found themselves treated as servants rather than family members, working long hours for their keep with little affection or consideration. Yet even these imperfect arrangements provided something crucial: a place in the social order, protection from the worst ravages of poverty, and the possibility of advancement that would have been impossible for a truly orphaned child wandering the roads. The feudal system itself, for all its inequities, created its own forms of protection for children. A lord's obligation to his tenants extended to their children, particularly in times of crisis. When harvest failed or plague struck, the manor's resources were expected to sustain all who lived upon the land. Lord Geoffrey of Thornbury, whose manor records survive from the early 14th century, regularly distributed grain from his stores to feed the children of families who had fallen on hard times. This wasn't mere benevolence, but recognition that the manor's future prosperity depended on having enough hands to work the land. The feudal system also provided pathways for advancement that could transform a child's entire life trajectory. A peasant boy who showed particular aptitude might be selected to serve in the lord's household, where he could learn skills that would elevate him far above his origins. a girl who caught the attention of the lady of the manor might find herself trained in the domestic arts that would qualify her for service in a great household, a position that offered security and status far beyond what her birth would normally allow. Village communities themselves formed tight-knit support networks that functioned almost like extended families. In the small settlements that dotted the medieval landscape, everyone knew everyone else's business, and this intimacy created obligations as well as opportunities. When young Peter's parents both died of fever, the village didn't wait for relatives to claim him or for the church to intervene. The baker's wife, who had lost her own son the previous winter, simply took Peter in. The arrangement was formalized with a handshake and the understanding that Peter would work in the bakery in exchange for his keep. These informal arrangements were remarkably common and effective. Village records from across medieval Europe are filled with such adoptions, apprenticeships, and foster-age agreements. They represent a form of social insurance that operated without formal institutions, but with remarkable consistency. The village understood that abandoned children would either become productive members of the community or dangerous threats to its stability. Self-interest, as much as compassion, motivated these protective impulses. The merchant classes developed their own sophisticated networks for protecting and advancing their children. Trading partnerships often included provisions for the children of deceased partners, ensuring they would receive both financial support and training in the family business. The great trading houses of Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League operated like extended families, with children moving between different branches to learn various aspects of commerce and to strengthen the bonds that held these commercial empires together. Young Francesco Dattini, whose merchant father died when he was 13, found himself taken under the wing of his father's trading partners. They not only managed his inheritance, but provided him with the education and connections necessary to become one of the most successful merchants of his generation. His letters, which survive in remarkable detail, reveal how these commercial families functioned as mutual support networks, sharing not just profits and losses, but responsibility for the welfare of all their members' children. The craft guilds went beyond their formal apprenticeship programs to create what amounted to medieval social clubs for young people. Guild festivals, religious celebrations, and seasonal gatherings provided opportunities for children and young adults to form friendships and alliances that would support them throughout their lives. These social networks were particularly important for young women who often found their options severely limited by gender restrictions. The guildwives, the women married to guild members, formed their own informal networks that could provide protection, advice, and opportunities for women and girls who might otherwise have few resources. Even the dangerous and uncertain world of medieval travel had its own protective networks for children. Pilgrimage routes were dotted with hospices and religious houses that provided shelter specifically for young travelers. The Great Pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, for instance, had developed an elaborate infrastructure designed to protect and support pilgrims of all ages. Children traveling alone, whether as penitents or simply seeking opportunities elsewhere, could find shelter, food, and protection at regular intervals along the route. The legal systems of medieval Europe, primitive though they were by modern standards, recognized special protections for children. The concept of wardship ensured that orphan children of the nobility would be protected and their inheritance preserved, even if the system was often abused for the benefit of guardians rather than wards. Similarly, the church courts maintained jurisdiction over orphans and could intervene when children were being mistreated or exploited. These legal protections extended to children from lower social classes as well. Manor courts regularly heard cases involving the mistreatment of apprentices or the neglect of orphaned children. While the punishments were often light and enforcement inconsistent, the very existence of these legal frameworks represented a recognition that children deserved protection and that the community had an obligation to provide it. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created their own forms of mutual support. During harvest time, children from struggling families would be welcomed into more prosperous households to help with the work, earning their keep and often learning valuable skills. These arrangements provided temporary relief for families under stress, while ensuring that the crucial work of bringing in the crops was completed. Similarly, during the long winter months when work was scarce, communities would often pool resources to ensure that no child went hungry or froze for lack of fuel. The religious calendar itself created opportunities for community support of children. During major festivals, it was customary for prosperous families to provide meals for the poor, with particular attention paid to ensuring that children received adequate food. The Feast of St. Nicholas, in particular, became associated with gift-giving to children, a tradition that recognized their special vulnerability and the community's obligation to care for them. These networks of support weren't perfect. Children could still fall through the cracks, particularly during times of widespread crisis like plague outbreaks or famines. The support provided was often conditional on the child's willingness to conform to community expectations and religious teachings. Children who were seen as difficult, disabled, or morally suspect might find themselves excluded from these protective networks, left to survive as best they could. Yet for all their limitations, these medieval support systems represented a remarkable achievement. In a world without formal social services, government welfare programs, or professional child welfare agencies, communities created informal but effective networks that could identify vulnerable children and provide them with the resources they needed to survive and even thrive. These networks were sustained not by bureaucratic mandate, but by the recognition that the community's future depended on successfully raising its children. The effectiveness of these networks can be seen in the remarkable stories of social mobility that dot medieval records. Children born into the humblest circumstances could, with the right combination of ability, opportunity, and community support, rise to positions of authority and influence. The Church, in particular, provided pathways for advancement that were based more on merit than birth, allowing talented children from poor families to achieve positions that would have been impossible in secular society. The psychological impact of these networks on medieval children cannot be underestimated. Knowing that the community had a stake in their welfare, that there were multiple layers of protection and support available to them, provided a sense of security that helped children develop the resilience necessary to cope with the harsh realities of medieval life. Even children who never needed to rely on these networks directly benefited from knowing they existed. These medieval approaches to child welfare offer lessons that remain relevant today. They demonstrate the power of community-based solutions to social problems and the importance of creating multiple overlapping systems of support for vulnerable populations. They show how economic self-interest and moral obligation can align to create effective protective systems. Most importantly, they illustrate how societies can successfully nurture their children even under the most challenging circumstances. The children who grew up within these protective networks carried forward not just the practical skills and knowledge they had acquired, but also an understanding of their obligations to the next generation. Having been supported by their communities, they understood their responsibility to provide similar support to the children who came after them. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of protection and care that sustained medieval communities through centuries of hardship and uncertainty. As we examine these medieval networks of support, we see children who were far from helpless victims of circumstance. Instead, we see young people who were actively integrated into complex social systems designed to nurture their development and protect their welfare. These children learned not just to survive, but to contribute meaningfully to their communities, carrying forward the traditions and knowledge that would sustain future generations. In their resilience and adaptability, we find both inspiration and instruction for our own efforts to protect and nurture the children in our care. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into how medieval children survived harsh times, we find ourselves at a remarkable crossroads of history and human resilience. Throughout this journey, we have witnessed the extraordinary capacity of young souls to endure, adapt, and ultimately thrive despite circumstances that would challenge even the most hardened adults of today. The children of medieval times were not merely passive victims of their era's brutalities. They were active participants in their own survival, developing sophisticated psychological mechanisms that modern psychologists are only beginning to fully understand. Their ability to compartmentalize trauma while maintaining hope speaks to an innate human capacity for resilience that transcends time and circumstance. When faced with the constant specter of death from disease, war, or famine, these children learn to live fully in the present moment while still planning for an uncertain future. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval children possessed an emotional intelligence that allowed them to navigate complex social hierarchies with remarkable skill. They understood instinctively that survival often depended not just on physical strength or material resources, but on the ability to forge meaningful connections with others. Whether it was the bond between master and apprentice, the solidarity among village children, or the protective relationships within extended family networks, these young people recognized that their individual fate was inextricably linked to the well-being of their community. The educational systems of medieval times, while vastly different from our modern approaches, created individuals who were remarkably practical and adaptable. Children learned not through abstract theories but through direct experience and observation. They developed skills that were immediately applicable to their daily lives, whether it was learning to read the weather patterns that would affect the harvest, understanding the subtle social cues that could mean the difference between acceptance and rejection, or mastering the physical techniques required for their chosen trade. The role of storytelling and oral tradition in medieval childhood cannot be overstated. These narratives served multiple functions beyond mere entertainment. They were vehicles for transmitting cultural values, teaching moral lessons, and providing psychological comfort during difficult times. The stories of brave knights, wise queens, and miraculous saints gave children models of courage and resilience to emulate. More importantly, these tales helped children understand their place in a larger cosmic order, providing meaning and purpose even in the midst of suffering. The religious framework that permeated medieval life, while sometimes oppressive, also provided children with a source of strength and comfort that sustained them through their darkest hours. The belief in divine providence and the promise of eternal reward gave meaning to temporal suffering. The rituals and ceremonies of the church provided structure and predictability in an otherwise chaotic world. The concept of divine justice offered hope that wrongs would eventually be righted, even if not in this life. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life taught children profound lessons about patience, preparation, and the cyclical nature of hardship and abundance. They learned to work hard during times of plenty in preparation for leaner periods. They understood that winter always gives way to spring, that periods of suffering are followed by times of joy. This deep connection to natural cycles provided a framework for understanding and coping with the inevitable ups and downs of human existence. The guild systems and apprenticeship programs of medieval times created pathways for social mobility that, while limited, still offered hope for advancement. Children learned that through dedication, skill, and perseverance, it was possible to improve their circumstances. The master craftsman who had once been an apprentice served as a living example that progress was possible. This knowledge provided motivation and direction for young people seeking to better their lives. The extended family networks and clan structures that characterized medieval society created multiple layers of support and protection for children. When parents died or became unable to care for their offspring, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins stepped in to provide care and guidance. This distributed system of responsibility ensured that children were rarely left completely alone to face the world's dangers. The practical skills that medieval children developed served them throughout their lives and equipped them to face whatever challenges arose. They learned to be resourceful, to make do with limited materials, and to find creative solutions to complex problems. These abilities served them well not only in their daily survival, but also in adapting to changing circumstances as they arose. The social intelligence that medieval children developed allowed them to navigate complex interpersonal relationships with remarkable skill. They learned to read people's motivations, to understand the unspoken rules that govern social interaction, and to build alliances that could prove crucial in times of need. This emotional sophistication helped them not only survive, but thrive in their challenging environment. The legacy of medieval childhood survival strategies continues to resonate today. In our modern world, where children face different but equally challenging circumstances, we can learn valuable lessons from their medieval predecessors. The importance of community support, the value of practical education, the power of storytelling and meaning-making, and the necessity of developing emotional resilience remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Modern child psychologists and educators are increasingly recognizing the wisdom embedded in many medieval approaches to child rearing. The emphasis on experiential learning, the integration of work and education, the importance of intergenerational relationships, and the value of spiritual and cultural frameworks for making sense of life's challenges all have applications in contemporary settings. The children of medieval times remind us that human beings possess an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and survival. They show us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, the human spirit can not only endure, but flourish. Their example teaches us that resilience is not just about individual strength, but about the collective support systems that communities create to protect and nurture their most vulnerable members. As we reflect on these lessons from the past, we are reminded of our responsibility to create environments that support the healthy development of children in our own time. While we may face different challenges than our medieval ancestors, the fundamental needs of children remain constant. The need for security, belonging, purpose, and hope. By learning from the strategies that enabled medieval children to survive and thrive, we can better equip ourselves to meet these needs in our contemporary world. The story of medieval childhood is ultimately a story of triumph over adversity, of the human capacity to find light in darkness, and of the enduring power of community, faith, and hope to sustain us through life's most difficult challenges. It reminds us that while circumstances may change, the fundamental human need for connection, meaning, and purpose remains constant across the centuries. In honoring the memory of these remarkable young survivors, we commit ourselves to creating a world where all children have the support, resources, and opportunities they need not merely to survive, but to flourish and thrive.